Okay, we're gonna get started. It is like 11:01-ish, just 5 o'clock on the wall. We'll see if it's actually. Okay. All right, we're gonna continue talking about floods today, and then we're gonna move into water pollution, and we'll get through as many items in water pollution as we can, and that will of course roll over into Tuesday. I like this particular picture of water pollution because it gives you this idea of what it is that we're talking about. It's something that shouldn't be there normally in terms of pollution. There are lots of different things then that very broad definition covers. I think this type of water pollution, where you have something oily that's dripped out of a car, or it's like an oil spill, or you have some type of chemical that's in the water, as not normal for that. It's very common when we think of water pollution. We often also think of plastics or waste, solid waste that's in water as water pollution. We're going to talk about those kinds of pollution in detail. It's actually where we're going to start with this discussion after we finish talking about floods. But I want to broaden this definition and start to think about other types of pollution that are less obvious. So the thing I always keep in mind when I think about water pollution is that this is one time when rainbows are not cool. Okay. That seeing a rainbow on water indicates that, again, you have some type of chemical that's there that probably shouldn't be there. My kids have, this is like somehow ingrained in their mind. Like if we see water and there's like that rainbowy kind of oily sheen on it, they're like, there's pollution here. That's terrible. And I'm like, that's awesome, but we can't do anything about it when we're carrying the grocery shop in the grocery store. And that's something else to kind of consider with pollution, and all these types of pollution that we talk about throughout this semester, is what can we do about it? What are the actionable things that we can do to either prevent this, which is the desired thing, or to clean it up afterwards, which is what we often end up treating with water pollution. Okay, so on this piece of paper that you have in front of you, our review questions to start today are, do you remember perhaps what the prediction is for how high sea level should get with climate change, the various factors for sea level rise, by 2100? What was our projection that we had at the end of class on Tuesday? And of course, you can talk to your neighbor about this. You can look back in your notes. The second question is, give me 2 concerns that would be problematic for sea level rise. Like, why is sea level rise a problem? Okay, and again, we have not talked about that in any kind of detail at all, so this is definitely something that is what you're thinking and what you understand as a potential problem. And then the third thing here is you wrote me a goal on that first day of class, which is like a week and a half ago now. It's supposed to be like a 2-week goal. How are you doing on the goal? Okay, if you can't remember it, I can remind you. I have the papers you're in class today. And if you're achieving your goal, that's awesome. If you're like, I haven't done anything and I can't remember what it is, what do you need to achieve that goal? Okay, like it can be something that I can provide for you. It can be something that you know that you just need to do, like write it down. Okay, so 2 facts, essentially, and feeling question.
I think it was like 3 feet.
Ask me again.
We're thinking about the sea level rise. I'm trying to think of the amount. I remember talking about how little of an amount could affect, say, some of the Polynesian islands.
That's true. But, right, yeah. And so, like, why would that be a problem that would flood an island in the Philippines?
I'm still sticking with like 3 feet because that's for some reason that's sticking in my mind. But I think like some of the islands it could have been just like 1/8 of an inch.
Give up on the markers today. Okay.
Centimeters.
52 centimeters. So I think that's close to 3 feet, isn't it?
Centimeters, 52 centimeters?
Oh, centimeters and inches and centimeters got me confused.
Yeah. Now I've got to figure that out because I'm curious. I think you're right.
I know I'm a little bit wrong because 52 centimeters isn't the same as inches.
It's 20, almost 21 inches.
All right, almost 2 feet. All right, I was only off a foot.
Not yesterday, but like yesterday and this class days. Baseball. No, that's.
I don't think I spelled that right.
If you don't remember your goals, okay. Okay. How much is sea level predicted to rise by 2100?
2 feet.
Yeah, somewhere in the order of 1 to 2 feet. What is that in centimeters about? What is that? Rebecca?
52 centimeters.
52 centimeters. Yeah, 40 to 60 centimeters. Okay. And that's come down, as I mentioned, on Tuesday from our kind of first estimate that came out of the International Panel on Climate Change, which was closer to a meter, which would be more like 3.
That's
okay?
where I got that 3
And so
feet.
remember, a meter is 100 centimeters. So 40 to 60 is still the majority of that, but it's much less than we have originally here. Yeah, like
Is it possible that the recommendations could keep going down?
yes, like it could keep getting better. What I would say is that the current outlook is poor, and that actually the glaciers in the Antarctic land-bound ice caps are melting faster than kind of this current prediction encompasses. So it's looking like 40 to 60 is pretty much the target. Definitely things could change, and this could fall back or stop. One thing to always keep in mind is that the heat that we have on the planet continue to increase. Like even if we stopped carbon dioxide emissions today, which is the main driver of global warming, the Earth would continue to heat just from the carbon dioxide we have. And so the ocean is going to continue to take up a significant fraction of that heat, and those water molecules are going to continue to expand. Even if we could, invent some device that would freeze the glaciers and the ice caps in place, there's still going to be this thermal expansion of the ocean that's going to continue for a period of time. So there's no scenario where it doesn't go up. Okay. Some of it. So that is important to keep in mind. Again, we usually talk about these really worst case scenarios, but it could actually be better and be less. Okay. What would be the problem with that amount of sea level rise? What would be some concerns?
Masses that are just barely above sea level will be submerged.
Right, we'll get flooding, which is why we talk about it in this kind of section for the first time. Yeah. Good. We're gonna have that freshwater intrusion. That we talked about back with drought. What else? Yeah.
Potential loss of that biodiversity.
Good. We keep mentioning that. Okay. All of these things have that concern. Yeah.
Like runoff, but instead of running off, it's just going to be mixing with like pesticides and fertilizers. Just going to be mixing with instead of running off into it.
Okay, we're gonna get pollution. Yeah.
Go over like in Florida and islands.
Yeah. So, what's bad about that?
Landlocked.
Infrastructure. Yeah. So here we get problems with overpopulation, even more kind of smushed together on less land.
I've heard some people say that it could affect the way the oceans flow.
Yes. And that is very speculative. And I think most of our concern there is like we super don't want to think about that. The ocean currents have been quite stable in the circulation belt that I alluded to when we first talked about water resources for several millennia as these ocean basins in the continents have settled in their current positions. And that's all changing on a very long geologic timescale as the tectonic plates shift around. So the ocean basins will get bigger and they'll retract and the ocean currents will move around in there. I think what's really concerning about the flow of these big ocean currents is that right now that distributes heat around our planet. It takes warm water from the equator and it sends it to the poles. And if that breaks down, then we're going to lose a bunch of our kind of normal climate regime that we just depend upon today. Largely in the mid and kind of polar latitudes, they're going to potentially get a lot colder and their precipitation regime is going to change almost entirely. And that means that those regions that are doing agriculture for us that we live in today might become uninhabitable or might become inhabitable. And uninhabitable, sorry. And that's terrifying, okay? And that means that ocean productivity, how phytoplankton get nutrients and their access to light, and then the ocean food webs could also break down as the flow of warm water and nutrients kind of around the world's ocean shifts. Okay? There's that terrible science fiction movie that came out either the late 90s or the early 2000s. I feel like I was in college when it came out. It was like The Day Before Tomorrow. What was it called?
Yeah, that sounds right.
And it has the breakdown of the Gulf Stream in the Atlantic Ocean. And because of that, there's this crazy things that could not actually happen. You know, like an influx of like outer space atmosphere into North America that like snap freezes a big portion of the country above a certain latitude. That's the extreme version of this breakdown of oceanic currents. And because we aren't going to be moving that heat in these locations, then the places where people have developed civilization and agriculture are not going to be able to support that any longer. It's not going to happen overnight like it did in the movie. That's not actually possible. But long term, that's what we're looking at. And again, the time frame for that to happen is something that we might notice happening now, that ocean currents are slowing down, that they're not moving as quickly as they did before, that we're seeing that temperatures are changing in locations in ways that we wouldn't predict from our models that we have today based upon current ocean flows. We can notice it today, we might not feel the climatic effects of it, for 100 years, 250 years, until those things really start to have sucked out a significant fraction. That also means then that that heat that's building up in the ocean is going to be stuck in places like the equator, where it's going to get even hotter as climate change occurs. Yeah, that's pretty terrifying. And that's like a complete breakdown of our aquatic and our terrestrial ecosystems. Okay. The other thing I would say that you guys haven't mentioned yet is changing disease patterns, which is kind of the study of epidemiology. And there are fun career paths in this today as we try to handle the outbreaks of different diseases that are occurring, sometimes in relation to flood, sometimes in relation to drought. Definitely trying to make predictions of what diseases are going to be at the forefront of human health as climate changes. And that is linked back to this idea of sea level rise. That as the area and land is flooded, you're going to get more distribution of waterborne diseases. That's one of the problems with flood in general. But then also as people move and immigrate to other locations, they take with them the diseases and pests that carry diseases into places that may have no native immunity to those. And you've got more people packed more tightly together potentially, which increases the risk for outbreaks of these highly contagious things. And again, like cold and flu, like that's something that we can handle. It's the new, what we call zoonoses that appear, something that moves into humans from animals that we haven't yet developed an immunity for, or a vaccine for, or good treatment for, that is potentially really problematic. Yeah.
Is there a plan for the whole, like, ocean rising? I mean, like, you were talking about parts of Florida that were gonna be completely that are like big cities.
Yeah.
Are people just like not listening?
No, I had a interview just yesterday as I was in the car on the way home. And actually, right now is the the Bipartisan Council of Mayors is meeting in Washington, D.C., despite the government shutdown or whatever. And it's actually mayors in their local communities that are really taking on these problems of sea level rise. If you, as a mayor, live in one of these communities that's going to potentially be inundated by sea level rise, like they're doing things now. Okay, they're trying to build seawalls. They're trying to move homes and businesses back from the waterfront. They're trying to build up beachfront property. They're trying to plant mangroves or different types of seagrasses and salt marsh plants in order to stabilize their shoreline and then help them build up shoreline even though sea level is encroaching. They are really concerned about it because this is their community today that is starting to face this in lots of instances, even here in the United States. Potentially, I mean, really big places like Louisiana, Gulf Coastal, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida. A little bit in Texas, but Texas's water dynamics and coastal dynamics just place it just a little bit better for sea level rise. And so, like, they are actually doing something that they're super engaged with this. Even in Seattle, when we were out there in Seattle, the first year we were there, they passed like 3 new laws, and they were like, gay marriage was allowed, you could smoke and own weed in your own private possession, and they were going to build a seawall. So the big thing that year in Seattle was you could have your gay marriage while smoking weed on the seawall. And that seawall was intended to be built because they know that sea level is going to rise and it's going to flood the port of Seattle. Okay, like the whole reason they're there to begin with is because of that trade and infrastructure. And so they need to build something to protect that, or they need to build something to give them time to build up the infrastructure so that it will not be flooded.
That's interesting. Years ago, my ex-husband had a construction project in the Keys, and they had to bring everything in by water to construct this huge house. But I remember him commenting on how annoying it was that only at certain times and a certain number of times a month could a boat come through because of the mangroves.
Yes.
Because it was seriously regulated to disrupt their growing environment, and I'm thinking it probably has something to do with that.
Yes. In lots of harbors, you can only enter the harbor at high tide when there's enough clearance and there's enough water that's flooded in that time of day to give clearance for boats to come in. And that's exactly what was happening here. They probably had extra restrictions because of the mangroves, and they didn't want any damage to them. And they didn't want to interfere with their germination processes or if they had seeds floating around or stuff like that. That's why we have those types of protections. That's a good example of people that are dealing with these types of flood scenarios and are trying to be forward thinking about it in terms of what they have. And of course, there are lots of reasons besides flooding and sea level rise that we want to protect.
So is an ocean hole like a dam?
Yeah, it's like a dam on the ocean. And it depends upon how you build it as to how pliable or flexible it is to water movement. You know, you can build structures that it's literally just a wall, you know, concrete structure. And that's generally what we think of when what we're saying we're going to build when we build a seawall. But these can be piers that kind of change local ocean currents to build up land on one side and then you get a little bit of depletion on the other side. They can be structures that you can open or close that can float on the surface of the water to some extent, so they can rise the tides and other kind of aspects like that. There are lots of options when it comes to this, but a community has to decide to pay for that. Like it's going to cost money. Yeah.
There's no wall, like, an ocean wall, like, affect, like, all these things you're talking about, like the rock islanders, or like chains, that also have a negative impact on that stuff?
Yes. And that is one of the big concerns that comes with this, is that if we're going to protect human civilization and trade and infrastructure, it is going to cost on the environmental side. None of these solutions for humans dealing with sea level rise and staying in place with it are at all beneficial largely to the environment or work well with what's supposed to happen naturally. They're all aimed at preventing what is trying to happen naturally. And that's a trade-off. You have to decide, as a scientist, as a researcher, as a voter usually, where your priority lies.
Is there not a better way to do this?
Yeah, the best decision is to move and to quit emitting carbon dioxide. So it evolves. You've made the circle logic. Okay, oh, there's our daily blip. I think like the electricity goes off in this room like whatever time this is. Resets the computer. Okay, this is one of those last slides that we looked at in class on Tuesday. How much is sea level going to rise? It has an ever-increasing rate at how much it is rising, much, much higher than it has been in the past, 3.2 millimeters per year, which again, you know, a millimeter is a small amount, but it adds up year after year after year. You know, 10 years, we're looking at 2.2 centimeters. Okay, 100 years, you're at that 32 centimeters that we're thinking about. And as the rate increases, then we'll get into that 40 to 60 centimeter range. The different lines here, again, are different scenarios for how much carbon dioxide is emitted. Again, kind of the red line is the worst case scenario if we kind of ramp up stuff. The blue line is one of these median scenarios where we start to take action about carbon dioxide emissions, but there's still some long-term impact of the CO2 that we have emitted and that we will continue to emit. And that gives us this big envelope. Okay. All right, good job, guys. Okay, you can pass me your papers forward that you wrote your answers on, and we'll get that recorded. And then for the rest of class, we're going to fill out a little bit more of this stuff that you guys have just mentioned. What are the impacts of flood? Although as I mentioned, we covered the vast majority of talk a little bit more about flood impacts and consequences. Just make sure you have them in your notes, and we've more fully talked about them. And then we're going to start in on water pollution. And today, I hope that we get to talk about both sediment water pollution, which is the largest kind of by weight type of pollution, actually, and hopefully solid waste. And we'll see if we get to start in. The example of the picture on the slide here, this is a sperm whale that has become entangled. Actually, it's a gray whale. Sorry, it's a gray whale. That has become entangled in a lost or discarded fishing net. And it's one of the severe examples of interaction of actual marine wildlife with solid waste and water pollution. There are all kinds of videos for it that you can watch of people that are helping to disentangle organisms from these types of maiming, potentially lethal interactions with our stuff that is in the water. By and large, they're pretty profound. The most recent one I watched was like two police officers, they might have been animal control officers that have been called to the beach, and they were disentangling a sea lion from a net. the similar thing, like choking around the neck, had it wrapped around all his flippers. They got to try to cut, this wild animal out of this. The wild animal just wants to get away. It's very the other most recent one I watched was two fishermen. They might have been surfers. Same kind of body type both. They were out on the water and they saw these sea turtles that were entangled in a discarded net. And lo and behold, there were 7 sea turtles that they ended up rescuing out of this one net. And that is just a sampling of the scale of the problem. Those are just the organisms in these types of situations. Okay. All right, but first. Okay. This was, I think, the last slide that I showed you on Tuesday. We can wrap up our discussion about floods. This is the map again of the areas in Florida in red that would be flooded if we had a 1 meter rise in sea level, 100 centimeters. So we're probably not going to achieve that by 2100. But again, that's still in the future of Florida, okay? It might be 2150 or 2200, but there's nothing about our current trend in sea level rise that says that this will not happen. This is still very possible, just not potentially in the next 2 generations of humans. And again, we talked about these are big, potentially population centers that are going to be impacted, and the infrastructure that comes with that, and the cost, both to humans, both socially, as well as economically, that comes with flooding. In terms of this kind of 1 meter sea level rise, we're talking about 3 million people in the United States that would be directly impacted by flooding. This particular image shows you the area in Louisiana that would be flooded by a 1 meter rise in sea level. And so, but that's most of the boot of Louisiana. And again, you're thinking about New Orleans already has problems with sea level rise. It's always below sea level, and so it's always been very prone to flooding. Has seasonal flooding with the flooding of the Mississippi River. It has flooding when we have the hurricane events now. This would be pretty much wiping it off the map and saying you have to either build a very significant system to protect that city, or you have to move everyone out. And that's a big deal. And that's not insignificant. That's not insignificant in an area of the United States that traditionally has poor infrastructure and an economy that's just kind of riding. Just kind of making it. What we see is most vulnerable, again, Florida, Louisiana, New York, coastal California. We don't tend to think of Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama. Texas is very problematic. Mostly in the case of Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama, they just don't have a big shoreline. That doesn't mean it's not going to be flooded. It will be. There are just fewer people impacted directly. 150 million people worldwide, mostly in Southeast Asia and along the Indian Ocean, are right at the level today. And so any amount of increase in sea level puts those types of locations in danger. And again, that country of Bangladesh, which is a floodplain now, experiences seasonal flooding regularly to their own detriment. That country is like southern Louisiana. It's going to be wiped off the map by this amount of sea level rise. So certain cities that are definitely going to be impacted by this 40 to 60 centimeter rise in sea level, places like Kolkata and Mumbai in India, Shanghai, Bangkok, and Dhaka. Dhaka's in Bangladesh. Yeah.
Big cities, do they tear everything down before they leave it out? Or they just let the water take all this stuff?
I think that's a great question. How much do you want to invest in actually moving structures and putting them somewhere else? And then where are you going to put them? How are you, what is the transition for the government or private people being like, that land is now mine? I used to live there, it's no land, so I'm going to take your land. Who knows what the interaction is going to look like? I think for the average person, unless you build a wall where you prevent flooding, you're just going to let it flood. And you're going to have to rebuild somewhere else. Right now, our infrastructure for moving structures is for small structures. We can't pick up and move skyscrapers. I think a really big concern is our historical elements and landmarks that are in these cities that are in danger of sea level rise flooding. What are we going to do? Are we going to start scuba diving expeditions to them? Are we going to build bubble houses around them? Are we going to let them flood? Are we going to move them? How much are we going to pay for them, right? There are lots of ideas about how we could do this, or do we need to start building these cities so that they can survive underwater? Like, you know, what is our idea for how to deal with this? And again, we have no worldwide conception of what we should do or what the best technology or solution is. And so it's each individual community deciding for itself. I know, it's kind of cool. Again, you kind of got to start building now if we're going to manage that. Let's see. Okay, so again, these kind of concerns that come with flooding come in several different areas, and we can think of them again as environmental, we can think of them as economic, we can think of them as social. I definitely think the health aspect of this should rise to the forefront, in that we have this influx potentially of waterborne diseases that have been with us historically as a human civilization, and that we have conquered largely through the use of sanitation and antibiotics. And when those systems get overrun by flooding from one aspect or another, then these diseases have a chance to become locally epidemic. And the big concern is that sea level rise is happening everywhere all the time. And so the chance for epidemic becomes kind of global in proportion. And that again, as people are moving and trying to transition out of these flood zones, they're going to be taking these diseases around with them. And do we have the ability on a global scale today, with the potential for large population centers that are affected by this, to treat these? And how are we going to improve sanitation at the same time that flooding is constantly butting up against our systems? Okay. Definitely the ones that we're most concerned about are cholera and dysentery, which cause explosive diarrhea.
Yes.
And so
Just compounding the problem, because where's it gonna go?
right, exactly. And so when you have these types of outbreaks in places that are flooded, there is improper sanitation, so it's easy for them to spread. There are highly contagious bacterial diseases. You have to be hydrated in order to deal with diarrhea, which means you're going to be drinking water. And if that water is not clean, then you have very little chance of overcoming this. Particularly with cholera, you need an influx not only of clean drinking water to withstand it, but also the ions that you lose out of your digestional tract at the same time. It's really important for the appropriate treatment. Hepatitis is a viral disease that can affect different systems in your body. We most often associate it with liver failure. It's a long-term disease, and it takes a large course of antiviral medication in order to be able to treat. And so it's very expensive. And again, it's really easy to pass that to members of your family who are caring for you, even if you know you're ill. It usually takes a long time before it presents. In terms of agriculture then, as we mentioned, we're really concerned about saltwater intrusion because it'll impact freshwater resources for irrigation and drinking water. The other thing is that we're going to flood lowland agricultural floodplains where there is a lot of productive agriculture today in many communities. That rich sediment that's deposited by the rivers on their floodplains is excellent for growing stuff. And so when that becomes covered by sea level rise, we lose some of that arable land. In terms of ecosystem impacts, you're flooding the land, okay? You're drowning the ecosystem. And so again, we're changing the composition of the water and the soil back there. Some things are going to benefit, some things are not. And it's important to recognize that coral ecosystems in particular are shallow water, near-shore ecosystems. They grow very, very slowly. And the amount of current sea level rise is faster than the growth of most coral reefs. And so lots of our coral reefs are facing impacts not only from warming oceans and ocean acidification, but drowning from sea level rise. All right, with this loss of ecosystems, not only in terms of biodiversity do we have loss for the organisms, but those same ecosystems protect us. They provide that buffer to us from shoreline erosion, from high tides, from sea level rise. So as they're lost, particularly the root systems of these vegetation, then we lose all that insurance that we have from severe weather events sometimes.
Is there any way we can like help the ecosystem, like those ecosystem like mangroves in the region?
Oh, yeah.
Grows or anything?
We can definitely help the mangroves and the salt marshes by planting more of these types of plants and working on water pollution, a chance to actually establish and grow. And that means that we have to trade sandy beach shores in large part for vegetation. And so it's going to impact recreation and vacation opportunities. And again, that means that we have to think differently about how we're going to use our shoreline ecosystems. In terms of coral reefs, there's actually a fair amount of research going into finding fast-growing corals that still deposit calcium carbonate shells that can withstand sea level rise, ocean acidification, and warming. And identifying those species that actually do well under these types of conditions, and then seeding them out onto existing coral reefs. So that as we have a loss of certain types of corals, those corals that can do well are already present. We don't have to wait for colonization of them. That's great if you want to save the coral reef. Okay, it's not good potentially in terms of biodiversity or ecosystem dynamics because you're changing who the fundamental players are on the reef ecosystem, and that's going to have food chain effects that we can't well predict lots of times, particularly if that species is one that isn't natively in that coral. So again, there's always this trade-off. Okay. All right. The impact then economically of floods we can think of. So those are kind of the environmental, social impacts of floods. Definitely when it comes to the economic impact of floods, either from sea level rise or from any of these kind of seasonal natural causes of flooding, are things that we can readily identify. And again, we don't tend to worry about them, though, until they happen to us or to someone that we know. But in terms of sea level rise, I want you to start thinking that this is happening now and that this is impacting certain populations, even though it will never be a problem here in Ohio, very fortunately. First and foremost, it displaces people. People have to move either for the duration of the flood or in terms of sea level, they have to move permanently. This disrupts your community if like your doctor and your school teacher move, or your wastewater treatment plant operator moves. It disrupts the economy in your community. You know, the hospital is closed because it's flooded, which means nobody's going out for lunch, which means that the local diner's impacted, the local Walmart's impacted because nobody's coming to shop there. People aren't able to go to work because their places are actually flooded. Lots of jobs don't pay you unless you're physically present to be there. So floods have a really easy chance to disrupt our normal flow of money throughout a community. And that has impacts for families, has impacts for business owners, it has later on tax implications for the community. Okay, and then as people move around, say, and strengthen our support systems, which is another thing that I think we readily identify with, the places where people have to take shelter from floods need to provide services. When they go back to their flooded communities and rebuild, they need support services in order to do that well and to do it in a healthful and safe fashion. All right. If we're long term, you gotta either protect or move the city. That's one of the things we've been talking about. This definitely affects property values, which maybe we haven't considered in depth yet in class. Consider that your property today on the coast is valuable because it's on the coast. You can have access to the ocean, you can have access to the land, you can rent your home as a seaside vacation place. Lots of times these coastal communities are built and are valuable because they are on the coast. They have access to recreation and trade opportunities. Now that valuable coastal property is the next community inland. And your property becomes valueless because you're going to be flooded permanently. Yeah, so that means insurance rates go way up. If you're going to be insuring coastal property today, it's much more expensive to do that because we know flooding coastally is more severe than it has been in the past. And we know that you're likely to be flooded in some of these locations. We can draw those maps and say, hey, what's the point? That has costs then for you as a private landowner, and it has costs to the insurance community when we have to pay out. Okay, like rates are low because there are some people that are at risk pull in, and there are lots of people with low flood risk that put in. But when flooding actually happens, then everybody's rate goes up because the insurance company has it. So how are we going to handle that? Are we going to even flood insurance to people that knowingly purchase property and continue to live in a floodplain?
I worked in real estate for years, and in Richmond, if you live on the floodplain, it is not uncommon for your flood insurance to be more than your mortgage.
Yeah, and
a lot, like $700-800 a month just for your flood insurance, not just your homeowner's insurance.
I mean, you're really glad when it's there
Just say.
and not pay it, or
You can't get a certificate of occupancy without it.
right, you can't get a building permit for a new home without it.
Or you can't live in an existing piece of real estate without a certificate of occupancy.
It's nice computer workers and continue to go into. It stinks. And lots of times, the reason there are not homes built on floodplains is because of the floodplains for these types of insurance concerns. And so lots of times then we build public buildings on floodplains, like schools and municipal buildings, courthouses. And then when that gets flooded, right, then we all pay again to rebuild, to remodel, to ensure those types of problems. And so again, there's always this push and shove between people and the environment, even knowing what flood and all right, it displaces commerce. We talked about this in terms of flooding harbors and how we're going to maintain access and infrastructure for trade. The other thing we haven't talked about, though, is that flooding coastally affects fisheries, and that something like 75% of fishing productivity out of the world's ocean comes from the coastal zone within, 200 nautical miles of the shoreline. As we drown ecosystems, in the short term, we lose those fisheries nurseries. So that's going to be very problematic potentially for the productivity of fish until the new coastal ecosystems establish themselves. Okay, all right. So I want to leave you with some solutions, and we'll start talking about solutions to these types of freshwater resource problems in the water that are more tractable, have better answers for your questions. Kind of as we finish water pollution, so into kind of Thursday next week. But one thing to remember about dealing with floods is you can build a seawall, you can build a levee that can protect your local community. The difficulty is maintenance, and particularly with seawalls and levees, as floods get worse, you have to continually build them higher and higher, not only to just maintain them. And so that costs, and it costs more and more as these problems become more and more persistent. As that once in 1,000-year flood suddenly becomes once in 10 years. Is kind of the concern with most of these communities that are at risk. So first and foremost, the best prevention mechanism is to stop building in floodplains, either that's a river ecosystem that is known or the potential for flooding, or in coastal zones that are at risk from sea level rise, to stop issuing permits for new structures, so that we don't put people at risk, and so that we don't have to worry about insurance costs and paying out insurance. The other really big component, I think, to dealing with flooding is to build up and protect natural ecosystems. Having vegetation in place holds the soil in place and allows for a place for sediment and soil to accumulate, so the land will slowly rise up on its own over time. If you remove that vegetation, if you remove that normal community, there's nothing blocking erosion. And there's certainly no mechanism to build up the land naturally. So those buffers that exist have to be maintained, and we have to do a better job of nourishing them. Okay, we've got to think about our barrier islands and think about putting sand on them, not only for our recreational purposes, but then also for buffering us from sea level rise and storm surges. And that, again, it takes money. It takes knowledge of the ocean currents in the systems. It takes knowledge of the ecosystems in order to do that in a fashion that's going to succeed. Yeah.
So is this something that we could possibly see in like near future elections? Talking like, there's always like those people, presidential candidates that are more worried about the environment than others.
Yeah.
So like increases on taxes to start planning this kind of stuff. Is that something that we could see?
Yes, definitely. And I think that if this is something that motivates your vote, then you need to be looking for candidates and voting for them that are going to put forward this type of legislation and are going to support it. I think that in coastal communities, they're electing those types of mayors. They're electing those types of financial officers for their city. They're electing those types of city planners. They're sending those people to their state legislature. The problem is the rest of us, okay? And that the coastal strip of any one state, other than Florida, and, well, Alaska potentially, but Alaska has its own issues, right? Isn't like a big voting block of their state legislature or their population. And so nothing happens. Again, you can do something locally, that's very impactful, but there's no national or state plan in most of these instances. And, if it was me, I would be up there with the flags and the posters, and I would be doing all the things that, you know, the anti-flood dams is, in order to bring attention to this, and in order to move this through legislative processes. But no one cares. Okay, until it starts to be a huge problem, no one cares. Okay, and we're at that point where it's about to be a huge problem. And it would be much better if we all did something today than we waited till it was a huge problem. Okay, like, we can do stuff today like not building up floodplains, updating the floodplain maps, unchannelizing rivers so that our sediment gets dumped back on the shoreline. That will help us today. But it's highly unlikely that stuff is going to happen at a global or national level. You can do that at a local level because there's just not a will for it. And I think the real question then becomes, you know, why isn't there a will to do that? Why isn't there a will to protect people and environment? Yeah, it comes down to money. So we should all go to a traded water system or something. Yes.
So we saw the impact that would happen, but what would be like the impact on Hawaii?
Hawaii looks pretty bad too. I'd have to see if I can find a map for us. Again, there are places in Hawaii that have really high elevation because they have these volcanic islands. So some portion of Hawaii will remain unflooded, but lots of the kind of big tourist attractions are within this 40 to 60 centimeter rise. And again, they have to decide, are we going to move back, or are we going to try to do something to keep nourishing the beach ecosystems, which is probably more likely in the case of Hawaii. They have they have the resources where they can dig up sand and put it there to bring their land roots. That has consequences.
Just set off the volcano.
Just so. No, we don't want to do that either. The last time that happened at the end of the Permian, we had a mass extinction. So not do volcanoes. But it would help with fuel. Okay. Does anyone know the one thing that's not mentioned on here that would help us with flood? Well, CO2 definitely will be our, like, always on our shoulder. Something that helps with both floods and droughts. Definitely water efficiency would help. This is like an infrastructure thing. We've already mentioned it. And it helps both with droughts, freshwater scarcity, and with floods. Lots of these are built by the government. Dams, okay? All right. Our traditional solution to both floods and water scarcity and droughts is to build dams. So where we can control the flow of fresh water in these different ecosystems so that it benefits us. We build these big reservoirs so that we can create a reservoir of fresh water for our uses. And then that reservoir then is also designed to be big enough to take in flood waters and protect downstream communities. We'll do all the ins and outs of dams and like why they're great, which we talked are these reasons, and hydroelectric power being the other really big advantage of these types of dams. And we'll talk about the kind of consequences of these dams when we get to these freshwater solutions. This is pretty much the largest dam in the world. This is the Three Gorges Dam in China that was built and kind of started up in the last 10 years. I wish I could tell you that this was, it is an amazing feat of human engineering, but it already has cracks, and because of those cracks, a large portion of the hydroelectricity that's able to be produced from it is offline. And so there are big problems with this dam, even though it was designed to be very, very beneficial to China and the Chinese population. It's had some really unforeseen impacts. Okay, all right, so I'm going to shift gears. Do you guys have any questions or other comments about floods? Good discussion. Guys are like way more into it.
What about mutating reefs and mangroves together?
That could be cool. I'm hesitant. I'm always hesitant when it comes to genetic engineering and genetic modification, and we'll definitely make time to talk in detail about genetic modification this semester. I think it can be amazing. I think it can give us and has given us products and medicines that we cannot have otherwise. I think that it does potentially have some aspects to it that could help us address all the various consequences of climate change, of which sea level rise is definitely one. On the large scale release of these organisms, I get nervous without doing some good experimentation before. Because I'm really worried that not only within that organism, when you start to change things, you're changing a bunch of pathways in addition to getting the outcome that you want. What are the long-term effects of that on the organism and that species? And then when we're talking about an ecosystem shift, you know, like this big kind of ecosystem shift along the coast, that's going to have food web impacts that we cannot predict well. You know, we might be able to say what it'll do to those users of the coral reefs and the mangroves, but what happens to the predators of those organisms? You know, what happens to the competitors of those organisms? We can't predict that until we experiment with it. And so I'm more than willing to do the experiment. I worry about the, like, just dispersal of it when they get out into the wild. Not because I think they're going to eat me, or that their genes are going to get into me. That's not going to happen. But I want us to have good understanding of what the consequences might be, and that we're ready to deal with those. We're ready to face things. Yeah, and again, a part of me is like, well, we're never going to be ready, so then you just want to do it, try it, right? I don't think that that's wise. Okay. Anybody else? All right, let's start talking about pollution. Another big aspect in freshwater resources is not only when you have too little freshwater, when you have too much freshwater, but what happens then with the freshwater that you do have, even salt water, which will bring in a lot here when we talk about pollution, what happens when it's not clean? What happens when it has something in it, a contaminant, that makes it less useful, either for us as humans or for the ecosystem in which it is supposed to be there? And this comes down to the idea of pollution. So our really super broad definition of pollution then is any substance or organism or heat or light or noise that impacts the quality of an environment. Okay? And so this means that it's not just the chemicals or solid waste that's in the environment. There can be a whole range of things then that could potentially degrade or change the quality of a habitat or an environment. And that means that we get to classify lots of stuff as pollutants then, okay, which should be good for us in terms that then we can start to regulate these types of items so that we maintain the quality of our environment both for us and the organisms that live there naturally. That's the purpose of this definition. And it's good for this class because then we can talk about all the different types of pollution. There's lots of pushback to this definition of pollution because then it means that lots of the stuff that we do normally get classified as a pollutant, and all of a sudden you got to start worrying about that. But that's where I want you to be. That's what I want you to start thinking of, is the idea that even the stuff that you might not have thought of as a pollutant is problematic for another organism or a certain part of our ecosystem. Okay, does anybody know what has happened to this particular little sea turtle?
Oil spill.
Is that an oil spill? Okay. Why is that problematic for the sea turtle? Oxygen's not a problem. That's usually okay. Remember, sea turtles, they're air breathers. So as long as they can get up to the surface and break the surface oil sheen, they're pretty much okay for breathing purposes. Yeah.
Does it weaken their shell?
It doesn't directly weaken their shell. Yeah. It can infect their food, so if it can cover their food, so most sea turtles are either eating seagrasses, which can get oiled, or they're eating jellyfish or sponges. So they can ingest a toxic amount if they do so. Yeah.
I'm thinking more along the lines that if you're covered in oil, you're probably not going to be doing so hot.
Yeah, and actually the use of the term hot is really important. They don't get cooked, they get too cold. Okay, the big problem with oiling for marine reptiles, marine birds, marine mammals is that it induces hypothermia. It affects their ability to maintain their body heat appropriately. and they get too cold. They can ingest a toxic amount, which is also problematic, but usually the short-term acute problem with an oil spill for these types of charismatic megafauna is that they experience hypothermia and death. Particularly for marine mammals and marine birds, the oiling, like the complete covering of their fur or feathers, it completely ruins the insulative properties of that. The reason these organisms can be in the marine environment is because they have very thick fur, they have a ton of air in between those hair fibers, between their feathers that they have, that keeps them warm despite being in and around cold water all the time. Okay, when you oil yourself, you compress everything together and you lose all that insulation. And so hypothermia is actually the big risk for these types of guys when it comes to oil spills. When we think about things like crabs and crustaceans, when we think about clams and oysters, when we think about fish, then we think about fouling of their ability to breathe and get oxygen in. It fouls their gills, covers those gill structures, and then they can't diffuse oxygen appropriately from the water into their bodies, in addition to the ingest toxin. And so that's why it's problematic. Does anybody know how you clean Dawn dish soap? Dawn. Okay, it's like on their bottle now, right?
You gotta protect it, don't you?
All right, we all know. Okay, so I want to spend just a couple seconds, a couple slides, reminding you of the sources of pollution before we get into the pollution. So there are lots of different activities. There are lots of different industrial processes. There are lots of different residential processes that produce pollution, that can be a source of pollution. By and large, for water pollution, the main sources are from humans, either on the water or on land, and activities that happen on land. There's not a lot of water pollution that's generated by industry and activity that happens on the water. Okay, most of it is runoff from the land. It gets blown there by the wind, it gets carried there by the water, precipitation, or it's purposefully dumped in the water. Again, big sources of pollution on kind of all these different types of pollution that we can consider. Urban development, people building infrastructure and living on land or near the water. The next one is agriculture. Okay, our growing of plants, livestock husbandry produces a lot of potential pollutants across a variety of types. Our transportation produces, again, a variety of pollutants. Most of them related to air pollution, actually. And those air pollutants, remember, eventually they cycle back down. And mostly what they're pulled down with is in precipitation events, which starts them into the hydrologic cycle. Industry, again, can pull in water and use it for a variety of processes that then end up getting chemicals or heat introduced to it. Industry can use water as their process, which can affect water levels, or they can expel pollutants both into the air, the water, onto the land. Power generation, of course, can lead to water pollution. Most particularly we'll see in terms of heat production, when we use water in these important cooling and energy transfer processes within electricity production. And then resource extraction, which is the politically correct term for mining. Okay, so resource extraction equals mining. And again, these are processes that we undertake on land usually that end up creating and generating lots of different types of pollution. Okay. So that's where this stuff comes from. These are the types of activities that generate pollution. Okay. Generally, we divide these two sources, or we divide these different sources of pollution into two categories, really big, broad categories, right? There's point source pollution, and then there's non-point source pollution. And just like there's a continuum between flood and drought in terms of freshwater availability, there's a continuum between point source pollutants and non-point source pollutants. Okay. In terms of point source pollutants, we can point to an individual process or homeowner and say that is the source of this concentrated pollutant. often. In the case here where we have this pipe that's expelling this red liquid into the grass, you can go, that's a point source of pollution. If we could turn it off or collect that pollution, we could get a really strong handle on the pollution that's entering the environment from that particular point source. Okay? You can point your finger to a leaky pipe or to an industry that's producing pollutants. So industrial waste, leaking septic tanks, we're like, yes, the source of that pollution is this leaking tank, are excellent examples of point source pollutants.
Yeah, so like you were saying, you collect that pollution, and then where would you put the pollution you're collecting?
That's a great question. In an ideal world, you would take it to a plant and you would feed it to some bacteria, and the bacteria would break it down into non-toxic compounds that you could sprinkle as fertilizer on the agricultural field. That is an ideal world. That ideal world does not exist. If you are able to collect this pollution, what most likely would happen is that you would take it to a waste disposal, like a landfill, that's designed to handle these types of chemicals, and you would leave it with that. They vary it. Yeah, tell me about that later. Yeah. That is the question. What happens when your containment system fails, which it will. And when we talk about solid waste later on in this semester, one of our best solutions to that is to burn it. It's for incineration, but it has a large CO2 generation aspect, which is why it's not done at a large scale for our either industrial or municipal waste. Okay, of course, non-point sources of pollution then are the flip side of this. And again, we often talk about in ecology and environmental science that, oh, that's a point source pollutant, that's a non-point source pollutant. But you could classify leaking septic tanks as non-point source pollutants too, because you may see just simply the consequences of those leaking septic tanks around the lake. You might not know exactly who owns those leaking septic tanks to point them out. You just know that this is happening in an ecosystem. In non-point source pollution, you have many diffuse sources of pollutants that when aggregated become a problem. But at each individual point of generation of that pollutant, it's not real bad. Okay? Like the tailpipe of your car is a non-point source of pollution. Okay, it's generating different pollutants in very low quantities. But because everybody drives the car, we have a problem with air pollution, water pollution, global warming because of our tailpipe emissions. You can point to those tailpipes and say it's a point source of pollution, and we have modified cars actually a lot in order to help with emissions. But it's not a problematic what's coming out of any one car. It's because we have so many cars that it's a problem. All right, so things that are generally classified as non-point source pollutants are things like tailpipe emissions, runoff from agricultural fields is a classic example. No one farmer is doing a lot of damage with the excess fertilizers or pesticides they're placing on their field, but when all of those come together in a river, then the concentrations in the river become problematic for the organisms and the people along the river. Livestock manure runoff has the same problem, fossil fuel combustion, those tailpipe emissions. Stormwater runoff, like we have just had this huge pulse of precipitation that is washing away all of the stuff on the streets, okay? That's non-point source pollutants, okay? All of our communities have put down salt and sand in order to deal with the ice. That's all now been rinsed off into our freshwater resources, okay? No one community is like, you're doing a bad thing by making sure people don't have car accidents, okay? But that becomes a pollution problem because we all have it. All right, sewage overflow is another great example. Okay. Again, lots of our solid waste pollution problems that we have are from non-point source pollution. There's no company out there that's actively dumping rubber duckies into the ocean to generate pollution. Okay, we can't go to any one industry and say you're the problem. Because we all have plastic lids and straws and utensils that accidentally get blown away from us on the beach, driving, or we have a burst trash bag and it kind of gets all over the neighborhood. We have a plastic pollution problem because that happens a lot. Because there are a lot of us using these types of products. Okay? No one person is really to blame, but an aggregated problem. Okay? That's non-point source pollution. That's interesting. He did some good things, and he caged on other things. There's always trade-offs. Point source pollution is easy to deal with because you can walk up to the emitter and say, you need to fix your septic drain. You need to stop the red runoff out of this pipe. Non-point source pollution is more difficult because you have to get a lot of people to take action before you can have a big effect. And that's much more difficult. That takes a lot of will that may or may not be there on a very individual basis. Yeah.
Do CFCs make any difference in the water pollution?
Fortunately, no. Chlorofluorocarbons, their impact has largely been problematic for the ozone hole, and so we'll talk about that in air pollution. What's likely is that we haven't studied it in water. And we don't have a good grasp on what concentrations are like in water and what would be healthy and what would be unhealthy.
Have we stopped using CFCs?
Yes, but so we had this amazing treaty that pretty much stopped the production of CFCs around the world in the early 1990s, late 1980s when this research came out. And everybody got on board. It was really easy to do because the industries that were making and using CFCs were very limited, and we could give them a synthetic compound to replace them. What has been found, though, is that there are sources of CFCs now. The CFC concentrations in the atmosphere are actually rising again, which is, you're like, how? Because nobody should be making them anymore. And those smoke trails have been tracked back to China. So there are committees in China that have started using them and producing them.
Backlash to that?
Those types of treaties, are regulated at the UN, and China sits on the security council. The U.S. isn't going to do it. This treaty passed, but it was enforced at the time, again because there was a public outcry about it. But even though it's been publicized that CFCs are being produced again, and it's from China, there's no public outcry or will to pressure China to stop. Right, because we all owe China money, and we all are potentially benefiting from those industries that China is producing goods from. Sure, if we had another treaty and we, sanctioned them about this, then sure that would have an effect. Okay. The last thing for today, I think we want to mention our first type of pollution. We'll see if we can get into solid waste here. We got 10 minutes. Is sediment. Sediment is the largest type of water pollution by weight. Okay. And I think sometimes it's surprising to us to think of dirt in the water as problematic. And again, all of pollution is dependent upon dose. How much, what quantity, and what period of time is released. And so sediment released into ecosystems in some places is natural, like when we have seasonal flood, okay? You're supposed to rinse and erode sediment off, and it's supposed to be deposited lower down in the river ecosystem. That's normal. You're going to have some dirt stirred up. Sediment pollution is when we have excess dirt in the water than what should be there, or at times of year when it's not appropriate. And so, let me see here if I have the thing. I guess I don't have my amount here on here. Again, we don't often think about this as a problem, but it's actually potentially the biggest problem for aquatic ecosystems. Where does this dirt come from? It comes from land erosion. So again, when we remove vegetation along the coastline or remove vegetation around the lakes and rivers, then we have the chance for precipitation and wind to pick up dirt and deposit it in the water, and that can be problematic. It happens when we dredge areas, and so there's probably a couple things going on next to this agricultural field and the river ecosystem that they have, but you can see there's a big channel in the middle that may have been dredged out, where they actually take bulldozers or a ship with a dredge on it, and they dig up the sediment and they deposit it somewhere else so that we can build a channel for ships to go through. Okay? This can be really important for trade and commerce, but it generates sediment pollution. It moves that sediment that was in place to somewhere else that it might not. it's supposed to be and opens it up for erosion. If we dump sediment in dirt into water, it becomes sediment pollution. This happens really often in coastal development, where you're digging down into the earth, where you're gonna put that dirt, you put it right on the beach, and it becomes sediment pollution. Okay. Mining practices do this all the time. They're digging up the earth, and they're putting it on the surface of the earth, where it's not held in place by vegetation, it gets washed away by the wind of the water. And of course, development are digging in infrastructure to build buildings, to put in sewer lines, to build underground power lines. All of that contributes to sediment pollution. This is problematic, probably first and foremost, because it changes the quality of light that is present in aquatic ecosystems. Okay, we can see this. We know after it floods that the rivers and the streams get muddy. Okay, like the quality of the water changes, and most of the time you're like, oh, I don't want to go swimming in that until it settles down. It's gross. Okay, if you're like my kids, like they won't go in the lake water unless they can see their feet on the bottom. And so after they've been in there a while and stirred up all the sand and sediment, they're like, ah, look at my feet, look at my feet, and they run out, right? Okay, like no, there's nothing in the lake that can be, number one. Number two, like if a northern came up to us, I would be like, that's cool, and I'm like, my dad's gonna eat it. Anyways, it changes the quality of light, and we recognize this. It impacts our recreational opportunities, but it really impacts autotrophic organisms that are doing photosynthesis. Okay. When you add sediment to the water, the light cannot penetrate as deep down as it did before, which means that bottom-dwelling plants have the potential to die. Okay, they're not going to get the light that they expected, and they're going to have low productivity, and if it lasts long enough, they're going to die. The other thing it does is it changes the wavelengths of light that penetrate into the water. And so, blue light lasts the longest in the water, which is what gets reflected back to your eye. That's why the water appears blue. There are certain wavelengths of light that are supposed to be in the water. They get knocked around when they hit a little dirt particle in the water. That means that phytoplankton, the primary producers that live at the surface of the water, also cannot do photosynthesis and primary production to the extent that they were in the past. And that affects not only them and their survival, but then the whole food chain when you affect autotrophs, the primary producers. So that's the number one problem with sediment pollution, is that it changes light quantity and quality in the ecosystem, which affects primary production, which then has food web impacts. And again, it's dose dependent. If it's just a short-term impact where you have sediment come in and then flow out, those plants will survive and they'll bounce back. If it happens over and over again, it becomes problematic. The second big thing is that if you have a big enough dump of sediment in a location, you'll smother the stuff that lives there. You'll bury it. Okay? And that's problematic if you're what we call a sessile organism that's stationary and lives in one place and you can't move out of the way of the sediment dump. Okay, so again, bottom-dwelling plants, bottom-dwelling animals, particularly things like mussels and clams, that again are important filterers of other types of pollution out of the water, can be really affected by sediment pollution. How do you clean up sediment pollution? What do you think we could do?
Stop doing things that cause it.
Yeah, number one, try to prevent it. Okay, but we all know it's going to happen. So then what can you do?
Make sure it's in the first one.
Good, like try to clean it up, okay, which means like actively removing it, like digging it and putting it back where it came from, trying to stabilize it in another location.
So like digging it up.
Yeah,
Wouldn't that affect the ecosystem?
totally, yeah. I would say digging up is the quick, short-term solution if you have a huge sediment dump in an area that's blocking your ability to get in and out of a harbor. If you've had a flood and you've had a big sediment deposit from that flood, and now none of the boats can get in the harbor, you're going to dig that out. Okay, that's going to cause more sediment pollution in the long run, but it's going to solve your problems in the short term. It's going to destroy that bottom ecosystem one way or another if you dig it up. The best solution to sediment pollution is to let it naturally fall out of suspension in areas where it normally should do so. To open up those floodplains again, to let rivers and ecosystems deposit this stuff in places that nourish the coastline, which is so beneficial to us in lots of different aspects, okay? Both for agricultural nutrition, both for flooding purposes. That's hard to do because our current infrastructure is all about channelization, about making the river straight and preventing this type of sediment deposition where it should naturally happen. If it happens upstream, close to where it happened, there's not going to be a big ton of it that can be problematic. If we keep all that sediment flowing down the river, when it does get dumped, then it's some other stuff. Then it becomes problematic for harbors. So the solution is we have to change entirely, almost, the way we think about managing freshwater resources.
It would like, we went back to natural.
Yeah. And that's why you see a bunch of communities today that are doing daylight of their streams, that there are these underground culverts that are taking in stormwater that used to be streams and rivers to begin with. And now they're opening those back up so that not only do they have habitat, but they can have sediment deposition in place, they can have natural filtration of the water rather than just channelizing it into a pond. Okay, it degrades habitat as well. Of course, again, we talked about recreational opportunities. It's bad for organisms too if they get smothered or if they have these scuba implications. Just two examples of sediment pollution. This is southern Louisiana, the output of the Mississippi River Delta, and you can see all this sandy material is sediment runoff in the Mississippi. This is supposed to happen, okay? That's how Louisiana was built, as the sediment outflow of the Mississippi River. This is actually less sediment than normally happens in the Mississippi because we have so channelized and changed the way of the flow of the tributaries of the Mississippi River itself, to the point that Louisiana has problems with flooding and sea level rise. The other one, each of these trails of sediment in the water of the Gulf of Mexico is behind a shrimp boat. And they are trawling a big weighted net along the bottom of the seafloor to catch shrimp. And that stirs up the sediment and creates pollution in those. Those shrimp trawler trails, they can last for a day, they can last for 2 weeks, depending upon ocean conditions. All right, cool. All right, this is where we'll pick up on Tuesday, okay? Please do not forget that your homework is due today. So if you have a hard copy of your homework that you would like to turn in today, you are welcome to do so. Otherwise, you can turn it in on Blackboard under the homework assignments tab by midnight tonight. Okay, midnight tonight. If you are in extremes, your printer breaks, your computer falls apart on you, you can write it out handwritten on paper. Take a picture with your phone. Email me in a JPEG, okay? Like, we can do this. All right? It doesn't have to be like